All right, you just say when. All right. Well, hey, good morning, everyone. Obviously, if you are watching this video, it's because Mother Nature has not been very cooperative this weekend. And obviously, this is maybe a little bit different way for us to gather together, sort of virtually and online, but to just have a chance to really get this sermon series kicked off and to come together to God's Word and see what He might want to say to us this morning. And I know this is a little bit different, and as people have told me, every week it seems like since we moved here, they say, the weather is never like this. This never happens. So I'm beginning to think that you guys lied to me just to get us to move out here. Now, obviously, this is a kind of a unique weather situation, so this is just a unique solution to that problem, hopefully. So would encourage you this morning to remember that the church is not a building. The church is us. The church is the people of God. Whenever we're gathered together, and on a morning like this, however it is that we can gather together in God's presence around His Word to receive from His Spirit the power that we need to live for Him in the world. And to do all that today, we're going to kick off a brand new sermon series that I'm pretty excited about. It's called Come and See. And I actually want to get this started with a kind of a little video that sort of sets up the series. So we'll just take it from there. Now, I don't know how it strikes you all, but to my mind, there's just something exciting about that phrase, come and see. I mean, for the guy in the coffee shop, as he's thinking about what he can paint on his window, it's so much better to say, come and see, than it is to say, open for business. Right? Because come and see is an invitation. Come and see is a way of saying, what is going on in here is so new, it's so great, it's so exciting that I can't really put it into words. You've just got to come and see it for yourself. And as I mentioned this morning, we're kicking off a new sermon series called Come and See. And the idea behind it is pretty simple. You see, from the very beginning, the natural response that people have had to an encounter with the person of Jesus Christ is to go and grab their friends and their family members and invite them to come and see for themselves what He might offer them. A person would be walking along, they would meet with Jesus, and something about that encounter, something about the way He spoke, the things He did, the way He interacted with them, would just make something kind of rise up in that person. It would bring names and faces to mind for them. And they would rush out and grab people and say, you've got to come and see what this man is like for yourself. And in this series, that's what we're doing. We're inviting you to come and see Him for yourself, to see what it is He might say to you today and the difference that might make in our world. So, as I mentioned last week, the invitation to come and see is really open to anyone. So if you've got questions, great. We want you to come and see and ask your questions. If you're already convinced that Jesus is who He says He is, maybe you've been following Him for a long time, but great, we encourage you to come and see what else He might want to say to you today. And maybe you've got doubts or you're skeptical about things. Well, if that's the case, then you are watching this sermon on a great day. I'm glad that you're taking the time to do this, because today we're going to look at an encounter between Jesus and a person who really had some doubts about Him, who was really skeptical about what it was that He might offer to him. So if you've got doubts or questions or skeptical about the faith, it's a great day for you to listen to this. And if not, if you've got all your doubts and questions sort of resolved, maybe you know someone that it would be good for them to listen to this as well. So if you can, what I want to invite you to do is turn with me in your Bibles right now to John chapter 1. It can be the physical Bible if you've got that, an electronic version if that's what you use, like what I use here. In fact, if you're watching this online, the good news is you can hit pause and you can go find a Bible and come back when you're ready. But as you're turning to John 1, or once you're there, I just want to give you a little bit of background on this passage so that we're kind of all up to speed with things. So at this point in the story, Jesus is sort of beginning to collect some apprentices around him, people who are wanting to learn. He's just getting started in his career as a rabbi. Now again, back in Jesus' day, if you wanted to learn something, if you wanted to learn a trade, you couldn't just go off to college because, well, there weren't any colleges. So if you wanted to become a master in a trade, what you did is you went and found somebody who already did that, who was in that line of work, and you would apprentice yourself to them. So let's say you wanted to be a carpenter, right? You would go and find a master carpenter, you would work with them, work alongside them, and learn from them. If you're interested in sort of the financial industry, for example, you might go to a banker or someone who worked in trade, and you would apprentice yourself to them. But what do you do if you're really interested in using your life to wrestle with and to help other people wrestle with the big questions? Why are we here, and where did we come from, and where are we going questions? The what's wrong with our world, and how is it so broken, and what can we do to fix it questions. The where is God in the midst of all of this questions. When people had those kinds of questions in Jesus' day, they had to go and listen to the rabbis, even apprentice themselves to the rabbis as their disciples, because it was the rabbis who were asking these kinds of questions. So that's where we are. Jesus is sort of beginning to collect these apprentices and disciples around him. And as he does that, he has this encounter. So I want us to jump in verse 43 and just see what happens here. So it says, the next day, Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. Finding Philip, he said to him, "Follow me." Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. So Philip went and found Nathanael and told him, "We have found the one that Moses wrote about in the law, and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." And then Philip's response is so great. "Nazareth? Can anything good come from there?" Nathanael asked. "Well, come and see," said Philip. Okay, so what do we see here in this part of the passage? Right, Philip has this encounter with Jesus, and something about that encounter really stirs something up in him, and it gets him thinking, and he thinks, I have got to go find Nathanael, and I've got to ask Nathanael. He's got to come and see this man for himself. I mean, maybe Philip knows that Nathanael is wrestling with the kinds of questions that possibly Jesus has some answers to. Maybe he sees in Jesus the piece of the puzzle that Nathanael can use to really solve the riddles that he's working on. But either way, he goes to think about it, and he says, I've got to go find my buddy. So he finds Nathanael, and he says, "Nathanael, we found him. We found the man who can answer all of our big questions about God and life, and it's Jesus from the town of Nazareth." And Nathanael responds by saying, "Nazareth? I mean, come on, Philip. Can anything good come from Nazareth?" Now, I just got to tell you, I think when you look at this passage, something about Nathanael is pretty clear. Nathanael, I think, is a little bit of a snob. I mean, he really is. He's kind of one of these intellectual snobs because he thinks, all of the good ideas of the day, the life-changing, world-changing ideas, those have got to come from the big places, right? The power players, the people generating world change, they're in Rome, they're in Jerusalem. Surely they're not coming from Nazareth, because Nazareth is this little backwater, no-count, country bumpkinville kind of town. And he thinks, nothing good could come from there. I mean, it's kind of like when I was living in Oklahoma, people who live in the Midwest tend to think that, a lot of the innovative ideas, they're coming from the coast. They're from New York or LA or San Francisco, or maybe there's some good ideas coming from Oklahoma City or Tulsa, but not from the small towns, right? I mean, nobody's going to get a good idea from Tahlequah. Nobody's going to find a great idea in Mounds. I mean, they're going to be like Chakotah, Oklahoma. Can anything good come from Chakotah? Well, I guess that depends on the kind of music that you like, because Carrie Underwood's from Chakotah. That joke was a lot funnier when you were preaching in Oklahoma, I'm guessing. But it's also a lot funnier when there are actually people in the room to laugh at it, so that's all part of it too. But anyway, no, the thing is, Nathanael, I think, really wanted to dismiss Jesus without even exploring who he was, because of this preconceived notion that he had. He had this idea that nothing good could come from this small town. And honestly, I think that's a pretty common way for people to approach Christianity today. I mean, it's the idea that you hear a lot of times people say, Christianity, I've been there, I've done that, I went to church when I was a kid, or I see the way that Christians interact with other people in the public square, they're just a bunch of jerks. I don't think there's anything to offer me in Christianity. So their default reaction is just kind of to assume out of hand that it can't be true, it can't be helpful, and they just discard it. But honestly, I think if we do that, we're really just not thinking well. We're not being intellectually honest. Because if that's our approach to Christianity, really, if that's approach that we take to anything, we're really cutting ourselves off from what could be the very answer that we're looking for. I mean, when we dismiss an idea or a person out of hand without honestly doing the work of evaluating what they have to offer, we really do run the risk of kind of setting the question up in such a way that we can't find the unlikely source of truth. I mean, you know that. You see that all around town. Corvallis, lots of engineers and people doing that. Sometimes you've got to be open to going wherever the facts lead to finding the answer that you're looking for. So I think we do a much better job of finding honest answers if we're willing to explore all of the options and really only cross them off the list once we've really explored them and decide, okay, this doesn't have anything to offer me. And that's kind of where Nathanael is initially. So initially, he decides, okay, he's not going to go see Jesus. He's skeptical. And yet, in the next verse, we're going to see he still decides to take the time to go and see him. And I think that really raises the question, well, why does he do that? If he's not convinced he's going to help him, why does he take the time to go and see him? And I really wonder if one of the reasons that he doesn't do that is that he just thinks, I haven't been able to find good answers to the questions that I've got in other places. There's probably nothing to this Jesus man, but really, what have I got to lose at this point? I mean, I think Nathanael at some deep level just wasn't satisfied with the answers he had been able to find so far for the big questions he was asking. I mean, think about the world he grew up in. He was asking the same questions that many Jewish people in his day were. Every morning he woke up and he looked out his window and he saw that his country was still under the boot of the Romans, right? The Roman army was still there in his country. The country that God had promised was going to be this land of freedom where his people could live in freedom with him, and there is no freedom because they are enslaved and under the Roman thumb. And so I'm guessing that these questions of what's going on, God, how could you let this happen? God, are you ever going to show up and fix this? God, where are you in the midst of this? Those are the kinds of questions that he's been wrestling with. And he just hasn't been able to find a good answer. So maybe he's been to the other rabbis, he's not convinced by what they have to say, and eventually he just says, you know what? There's probably nothing to this Jesus guy, but what do I have to lose? And in a real way, that's my story. That's the story about how I came to faith as well. Maybe you can relate to it a little bit once you've heard it. So I grew up in the church. We went to church every Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, as far back as I can imagine. But when I was in high school, 17 or so years old, I really started wrestling with some questions. I really started thinking, okay, do I actually believe this? Am I really convinced that this is true? Am I just a Christian because I was, born in the South? And my parents have always brought me to church. If I'd been born in India, would I be a Hindu? If I'd been born in Thailand, would I be a Buddhist? I mean, really, is this stuff true? And, as I really wrestled with it, kind of thinking through it as an adult almost for the first time, I just had some bad experiences with the church, and I just said, you know what, this is not for me, and I just sort of threw it off to the side. And I ended up going to college still with a lot of questions about the world that I was growing up in, questions about, whether or not I believed any of this stuff at all. And, I still remember when I was in college, I was watching the news one day, and I was in college when the Murrah building was bombed in Oklahoma City. And, all those people died. And I just remember watching that, kind of seeing this happen in my home state and just thinking, what is wrong with this world? I mean, how can people do this to each other? I mean, for God's sake, there was a daycare in that building. And, I just was really chewing on some of these questions, and I just couldn't find answers that were satisfying and that were helpful. And it was about that time, I was in college, some friends and a professor or two that I really admired and respected the way they thought and the way they lived. They really pushed me. They said, Michael, you're not a kid anymore. I know you grew up in the church, but you're becoming an adult. You're thinking like an adult. maybe you should come and see Jesus for yourself. Really look at him and the claims that he made about himself with adult eyes. And like I said, when I went to college, I was not interested in Jesus. I had kind of pushed him over to the side. I assumed that Christianity didn't have answers I was looking for. But honestly, I was just sort of so lost in looking for better answers to the questions that I couldn't find. I just thought, well, I don't know, what have I got to lose? I mean, if nothing else, if I give Jesus a fair shake now that I'm an adult and I can think like an adult, when he doesn't pan out, I can cross him off the list with confidence. So I just began to work. I began to read and study, and I asked a lot of people a lot of questions. And all I can say is that kind of slowly over time, I just became convinced. I became convinced that Jesus is who he said he was, and that really he was the only one who had the power to answer the questions I had, the only one who was going to be able to change my heart and ultimately begin to bring real change to our world. Now, listen, if you're listening this morning and you have doubts or questions about Christianity, let me just say this to you. I cannot prove to you that Christianity is real. I mean, there is no way, I think, to debate a person into the faith because just so many people have so many questions, and that's kind of not how it works, in my opinion. But here's what I would love to do. I would love, and we as a church would love to have an opportunity to sit down with you and not try to debate you into it, show you we're right, make you believe what we believe, but instead to simply tell you our story, to talk about the difference that Jesus has made in our life, and to show you that while you may never be able to get all your questions answered, all your doubts sort of fully resolved, that there really are some good, logical reasons that underpin the faith that we have, that there are some really intellectually defensible reasons for putting your faith and trust in Jesus Christ, for believing he is who he says he is, and that he can do what he says he can do. But wherever you are, whether you're convinced already or not, what I just want to encourage you to do is go ahead and make sure you ask the question. Because here's the thing. An honest question is really a terrible thing to waste, right? Because every good question is an opportunity to get a little bit closer to the truth, whatever that truth may be. So if you've got doubts and if you've got questions, just whatever you do, don't just sit on them. Take the time to do the work, to look for answers, to see what the answers to those questions might be. That's my invitation, really, if you've got doubts and questions. It's just to come and see who Jesus is, because really, what have you got to lose besides being able to cross him off the list if it doesn't pan out? So let's jump back to the story for a minute, because I don't want us to get too far off track. So Nathanael decides, okay, I'm going to come and I'm going to see Jesus. And this is how that encounter goes as they come together. It says, when Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said of him, well, here truly is an Israelite in whom there's no deceit. How do you know me? Nathanael asked. And Jesus answered, oh, well, I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you. And then Nathanael declared, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. So Jesus sees Nathanael coming, and he kind of starts describing his character. He's like, Nathanael, my man, I can tell it. You're a straight shooter. You tell it like it is. There's no deceit in you. And my guess is that calling Nathanael a straight shooter, saying there's no deceit in you, that's probably a pretty gracious way to describe him. My guess is that Nathanael was pretty blunt a lot of the times. I mean, we've already seen that, right? Nazareth, what good could possibly come from there? And in that sense, Nathanael really reminds me of just about every single person that we worked with when we were living in Chile in South America. Chilenos are just incredibly blunt people. I mean, sometimes it's to the point of really seeming very, very abrasive. Like, for example, one time we were living in Chile, and I had come home for a couple of weeks to sort of visit family. And, when you come home and you visit family, you put on a couple of pounds because you go see grandma and she cooks for you, and it's just wonderful. So we get back to Chile, and I'm walking through downtown, and I run into this guy that we know from the church, and he's like, Mike, pucha que te ha engordado. Man, you have really gotten fat. And I was, trying to play it off like, well, yeah, grandma's cooking, maybe a pound or two. And he's like, no, como 6-7 kilos, right? No, you've gained like 10 or 15 pounds. It's like, thanks, Ernesto, really appreciate that. But I don't know, so maybe I think Nathanael is something like that. He's blunt like that. He's direct like that. And Jesus says that. He calls that out to him about his character. And Nathanael kind of stops and basically says, Jesus, where are you coming from? How do you even know me? And he says, oh, Nathanael, I know you because I saw you when you were sitting underneath the fig tree. Now, what was he doing underneath the fig tree? Really, we have no idea, right? He could have been sleeping. He could have been taking a nap when he was supposed to be going to work. He could have been just sitting there. But something about that, something about him saying, I saw you under the fig tree, it meant something to Nathanael. It meant enough to him that he just makes this 180-degree turn, because just yesterday, right, he was just scoffing about Jesus. Could anything good come from Nazareth? And then Jesus throws this one little comment out there, and all of a sudden he's like, oh my gosh, you are the Messiah. You're God's son. You've come to save us all. And just look at how Jesus responds to that 180-degree turn. Jesus says, you believe because I told you that I saw you under a fig tree. You're going to see greater things than that. He then added, very truly I tell you, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Now, you are free to disagree with me on this if you want to, but the way I read this passage, kind of the tone of voice that comes to mind to me, I think Jesus is being just a little bit critical of Nathanael here. I think he's pushing back on him just a little. It's almost like he's saying, really, Nathanael? I mean, yesterday you didn't think I had anything to offer, and now you're sold that I'm God's son? Like, all it takes to convince you is like a little parlor trick where I say I saw you under the fig tree? No, I think in a subtle way, Jesus is really pushing him, saying, Nathanael, look, if you've got doubts, if you've got questions, don't just jump at the first thing that tickles your fancy. Don't check your mind at the door, right? If you've got questions, make sure you do the work of finding the real answers to them. And here's the thing, sort of the takeaway for us today. If you've got doubts or if you are skeptical, I really do think that's okay. I mean, Jesus had a disciple who was pretty doubtful. In fact, he's even got a nickname that reflects that, right? Doubting Thomas. That name comes from this story where after Jesus had been brought back to life, he appears to all of the disciples, except Thomas isn't there. He's off running an errand or something. So when Thomas comes back, the other disciples are excited, right? They say, you're never going to believe this. Jesus has come back to life and we've seen him. And Thomas, I think in a really understandable way, says, I'm sorry. In my whole life, I've never seen a dead person come back to life. So it's hard for me to believe that happened. I know you guys say you saw it. I know you're excited. But that's a tough pill to swallow. I mean, really what it would take to convince me would be for Jesus to come back and let me actually put my fingers in the holes in his hands where the nails were. And a little bit later, Jesus has an encounter with Thomas, and I think he really commends him for that. In a way, it's almost like Jesus says to him, Thomas, I appreciate the fact that you have got doubts because this is not an easy pill to swallow. And I appreciate the fact that you expect to find good answers to your questions. You expect to find a good basis to put your faith in me. And because you're looking for that in good faith, I'm going to give that to you. See, I think if there's any criticism of Nathanael in that earlier passage, it's in that. It's that he was too quick to jump into things. So here's the thing. For those of us in our life, if we're pursuing Jesus, if we're exploring the claims that he made about himself, we really can't sit on the fence about it forever. At some point, we've got to make a decision. Do we believe that he is who he says he is or not? But my encouragement to you, and really I think God's encouragement to you, is not to jump too quickly. Don't let your emotions run the day. Only turn to Jesus if you're convinced that he's true. If through the work you've done, the way that his Spirit communicates with you, the way that you've explored and found answers, if you really do come to the decision that he's real and that he really is who he says he is, right? This is a big decision, and you owe it to yourself not to settle for anything less. And here's really a great and encouraging thing about all of that for all of us. It applies to all of us whether we've got doubts or whether we're already convinced that Jesus is God. There is really an incredible promise that is wrapped up in the very line of this little passage in there. And we don't really see it because in the original language, Jesus goes from talking you in the singular to Nathanael to use a different word that means you in the plural. And in English, you kind of does both of those things, so we don't see it very easily. But this is what he says, right? And when he switches from that you to the y'all, kind of the plural you, he's really talking to everybody who's around and listening. And in an important way, I think he's talking to us as well. Because he says, oh, Nathanael, you're going to see greater things than that. You singular will see greater things than that. And then he says this. He says, very truly I tell y'all, that's the plural you, I tell y'all that y'all will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Now, when you read that, doesn't that just blow your mind? I mean, doesn't that fill you with all sorts of new, just incredible theological insight? Yeah, probably not. I mean, I think for most of us, if that passage makes us think of anything, it makes us think of the opening to Led Zeppelin's song Stairway to Heaven, the angels ascending and descending, because that's really where they got the idea for that song. No, for us, when we read this, we don't see anything new or unique or original about it. It just seems like a weird thing to say. Heaven open and angels going up and down this ladder. But you have to understand that Jesus' original audience, when they heard that, they would have gotten what he was saying. They would have been just sort of electrified by the meaning that he was slipping in there, because what Jesus is doing here is he's quoting a passage from one of the central stories of their identity as a people, and it's just loaded with meaning. You see, the original passage that he's talking about comes from the book of Genesis. I actually preached about it last Sunday. But in that passage, the Old Testament patriarch Jacob, the man that everybody in Israel sees themselves as being a descendant of, he's on the run for his life, and he has this dream out in the middle of the desert where nobody's around. And this is what it says in the dream. He wakes up from the dream, and he's seeing this vision of angels going up and down and things like that. And he realizes what it means. He realizes that heaven and earth are not as far apart as he thought they were. That heaven, where God is, and earth, where his people are, that those things are actually intimately connected with each other. Right there in that very place where he is. And he says this. He wakes up, he looks around with this new understanding, and he says, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. Jacob was afraid, and he said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. So if you can, pull back for just a moment and try to see this verse, see the meaning behind this the way that Jesus' original audience would have. Because what Jesus is doing is he's taking that verse where he says, there was this dream and this place, this physical place where heaven and earth connected. And he says, you know what? You're going to see that here in me, right? You're going to see heaven and earth. You're going to see the heavens open and angels ascending and descending on me, on the Son of Man. Like by saying this in this way, what Jesus is saying is you guys don't get it, but I am actually the axis around which this entire world, seen and unseen, spins. Right? I am the linchpin that hangs all of this together. In me, in my words, in my person, God is here with you. Heaven and earth are joined together. When you see me here with you, you should say, God is in this place. And when you stop and think about how those words would have landed for his original audience, there is an incredible promise in there for us as well. Because I think what Jesus was saying to Nathanael and the crowd around him was this. He says, you're putting your faith in me, you're following me, you're looking for answers in me, and that's great. And you see that I've got this connection to God, but I promise you are going to see more. You are going to see more than you imagined. You are going to see heaven and earth come together in me in incredible and powerful ways. I think the promise that you see there, the promise that is laid out for all of us, is that Jesus will always, always be far more than any of us can imagine him to be. When we decide to take the time to look for truth, to explore the claims of Christ for ourselves, to come and see, it doesn't matter if we go into that with low expectations or incredibly high expectations. The amazing reality and the power of God is that when we approach Jesus, when we look for answers in him, he is always going to be more than we imagine him to be. So that's the invitation for you, not just today, not just in this series, but always. It's to come and see. Come and see for yourself how Jesus might fit into your life. Come and see how he might be more for you today than you could imagine that he might be. Would you pray with me? God, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity that we have to join together today, even if it's just through technology and computers, with this realization, Lord, that you are with us wherever we are. Thank you, God, that you came to this earth and you gave us the invitation to come and see. that you welcome us with our doubts, that you welcome us with our faith, that you welcome the skepticism that we might have. And God, that you invite us to bring all of us, our hearts, our minds, our wills into this exploration process. You don't ask anybody to check their brain at the door when it comes to following you. And God, thank you for this incredible promise that when we seek you, we can find you. That when we seek you, we will discover that you are always more than we imagine that you can be. So God, that is our deep desire today. We hope and we ask and we pray that as we go through our week this week, in the discussions that we have, in the questions that we ask, and the answers that we look for, that you would show up in your power and that you would show us how you are always more than what we imagine that you can be. Amen. Thank you for taking the time to spend some time with us this morning in what was a little bit of an unusual way. But I just want to take a moment and encourage you to join us next Sunday. We're going to continue on with the Come and See sermon series. And I've got to tell you, I am really excited about next week, because next week is all about an incredible party that Jesus went to where things got a little off the hook. And there's some amazing lessons for us in there as well. So would love for you to come back, would love for you to bring folks with you who might need to come and see Jesus for themselves. In the meantime, stay warm, stay safe, and weather permitting, we look forward to seeing you next week.